Thank you so much to everyone who's joined us here today. Really appreciate you taking out the time for such an important conversation. My name is Ritwika Bhattacharya. I am the CEO for Swaniti. To give a brief background without taking up too much time, Swaniti is a social enterprise that's an ecosystem enabler working towards a sustainable future in a climate-constrained world. All of those very complicated words essentially mean that we work with subnational and national governments and communities to see where there is opportunity, where we can provide support to enable a energy transition process at scale. Given that that's kind of our mandate of work, today's conversation just becomes that much more pertinent to be able to discuss and see how India and the US are looking towards energy transition. I don't want to get too much deeper into the conversation and request my colleague Sandeep to add more, but we're excited to see what the learnings have been from this study and where there are potential synergies and spaces for collaboration. With that, Sandeep, I'll pass it on to you and looking forward to an engaging conversation with such esteemed and incredible panelists. Sandeep, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Rituka. I also want to echo everyone and I really welcome everybody. And I want to start by saying good morning, good evening, and good afternoon, depending on where you are. I know that folks have joined from all over the world. My name is Sandeep Pai. I work as the research director with Swaniti Global. And basically, it is my absolute pleasure to welcome all of you to the launch of this new and very, very exciting report. I'm very excited, uh, titled Economic Diversification of Coal Communities, Case Studies from US in India. We will have, the way we will program this session is we will have uh, my colleague Ian Barlow, who has led the study, present some initial findings of the report, some very brief finding. It's a lengthy, big report, but he will share some brief findings, and then we will move on to a very exciting panel. We have speakers from all over the world, and I will introduce them subsequently in the order, and I will also detail out how much time each panelist have, and I'll pose a question to them. So that would be sort of the order of things today. Um, and I am very excited, and I once again welcome each one of you who have joined and who are interested in this, what I believe is a very, very important transition topic. But before I start, I just wanted to give some background of why we did this work, why this matters. And I always like to start with the question, the motivation. The question here is like, if you look at the last 12 months, we have already breached 1.5 degree climate target. Of course, this is not a long-term, climate breach. This is a short-term phenomenon. But if you look at different analyses, we are on the path to achieving 2.5 to reaching, not achieving. I don't think that's an achievement. To reaching 2.5 to 3 degree global climate target. And if we do that, it will be catastrophic for people and planet. And to contain this rise in temperature and to meet global targets, world needs to find a way to phase down all fossil fuels and achieve net zero. The good news is many countries have come up with their net zero targets, and that's the good news. But one thing, it is clear to me, working in this field for over a decade now, that we will not achieve our climate targets only through techno-economic solutions, investments in REs, whether it's in the form of like lowering the costs of renewables or alternate technologies. We have to find, we have to get our socioeconomics right as well. And one way to think about that is planning for those people, communities, and regions that will lose out as a result of any transition. And this should be sector agnostic. Today we'll be talking about coal and fossil fuels, but you could extend this argument to EVs and other sectors. There will be winners and losers, and we have to find a way to achieve just transition for those who might lose out as a result of this transition. although there is no silver bullet to just transition, just transition also means very, very different things to very, very different people. It means something different in India, it means different in US, it means different in South Africa. But no matter where you are and no matter what your framing of just transition is, one thing we can all agree on is that economic diversification is a core and key element of just transition. How do you get regions to diversify their economies in the long term? That essentially is the focus of what we did over the last 1 year. This report is really a culmination of a very long, year-long study that unpacks coal dependency and highlights new sectoral opportunities in 6 communities across 5 states in US and India. These states include West Virginia, Wyoming, North Carolina in the US, and Telangana and Jharkhand in India. And we designed this study to be scientifically rigorous. We deployed different methods in each places. And then the idea was to bring it all together and also raise the profile of the importance of economic diversification in just transition and through it energy transition planning. So that is the context under which we undertook this work. Once again, I am so thrilled that to see this report coming out, and I'm very, very excited that all of you have joined, and I welcome you all once again. I don't want to take more time because we want to jump into the report. And so for that, I will invite my colleague Ian Barlow to share some high-level findings of the report and share what we actually did over the last 1 year. And one thing before Ian, I pass it on to Ian, I encourage anybody who has questions to type it in the chat function or the Q&A function so that we can take your questions. And as we progress with this programming, we'll be able to pose them to the panelists. And also, if we are not able to address some of the questions, we can go back to them in due course. But we would love to hear your feedback on the overall programming. With that, I pass it on to my colleague Ian Barlow to take it away.
Thank you so much, Sandeep. Let me just share my screen really quickly. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for tuning in. My name is Ian Barlow. I'm a senior fellow with Swinity Global. So I'm really excited to present this report today. Sandeep gave a really good background on the what and why, so I'll just dive straight into the report. So just starting with the what and how, we started with 2 research questions. One, how does economic dependency on the coal industry look locally? And 2, into which sectors do coal-reliant places see themselves diversifying their economies? To begin answering this question, we looked at 6 different communities, both in the US and India, and I'll go into a little bit more detail in the next slide about why we chose these 6. Just briefly on the methodology, we used a mixed methods approach with desk research, interviews, focus groups. We visited these communities and also did some data collection. In particular, in India, we did a lot of on-the-ground surveys. My co-authors and colleagues, that was a significant effort there to sort of fill in the data gaps we had on the India side. So just really quickly, why these communities? A few factors went into why we chose these 3, but just to highlight 3 important ones. 1, we wanted a diversity in geography. 2, we wanted a diversity in coal sector composition. So some of these places have only coal mining activities, some only have power plants, and others have a mix. And the 3rd major component was the state of the coal sector. In some places, coal has been in decline for some time. In other places, coal is on the rise and is still like a booming industry. And then you have several communities in between. And so before I go into 2 example communities, unfortunately, I don't have time to cover all 6. I just want to sort of show 3 key ideas that I'd like you to keep in your head as I walk through them. 1 is that energy transition equals economic transition. 2 is that transition is not necessarily energy to energy. And 3, every coal community is different, and this affects their path forward. And I'll point to these 3 as we move through the case studies. So the first community I'd like to highlight is Fayette County, West Virginia. It's a community of about 40,000 in the U.S. region of Appalachia. It has a long history of coal mining stretching well over 100 years. And they've seen many coal booms and busts, but coal production and direct employment have trended significantly downward in the last 15 years. Direct employment has likely been trending downward for longer, but data is difficult to come by when you go back far enough. As coal has been in decline for some time, and due to these boom and bust cycles, there has also been a notable history of underinvestment, like in much of the region. And this connects back to the previous point about energy transition as economic transition, as these booms and busts and this downturn have had significant economic impacts in the area. That said, coal is still being produced today, which brings us to the dependence piece. First, we wanted to understand the county's coal dependence. Among our case studies, Fate is among the least coal dependent, due largely to the downward trend over the last 15 years. That said, dependencies do exist. Employment, tax revenue, electricity supply, induced economic activity, etc. For example, you can see here direct employment is at around 4%, we estimate. And importantly, coal jobs are among the best paid in these communities. And this is universally true among all of these communities that we looked at. And that means that this 4% can have an outsized impact locally. So just want to, after we examined the dependence, we wanted to better understand prospective sectors for diversification from the community's perspective. Based on community interviews, focus group discussions, public documents, et cetera, we identified several sectors of interest within the community. And these are sectors that community leaders and or local governments have expressed interest in or are actively pursuing. Some of these are currently prominent, others are nascent, others don't exist at all. But two things I would like to note across these sectors. One, tourism and outdoor rec is an evolution in how the community understands its natural resources. One of our interviewees noted this, and I think it's a point worth repeating. It's a movement away from a purely extractive relationship to a more symbiotic relationship with the natural resources there. And also it's worth noting that this sector was highlighted by most interviewees, and it's been very prominent both in the community and in the state. And the second point I'd like to make is that only one of these sectors is energy related. And I think that speaks to the reorientation of understanding natural resources, but it also underscores that as these communities evolve, coal communities may not be energy producers forever, at least not primarily or predominantly. Just to dive a bit deeper into a single sector, I just want to take a quick look at tourism in the county. We took a look at our interviews, existing strategies and programs, official statements, et cetera, to elucidate a few initial challenges, opportunities, and current or possible next steps to move the sector forward. In the report, we talk more about these at length, but just to highlight a few, one of the biggest opportunities for tourism in Fayette is the natural resources. The community has a ton of outdoor rec resources, including whitewater rafting, rock climbing, and hiking. And the community is already leveraging these assets and has been for some time. Among the challenges that exist is indoor lodging availability. Due to a variety of factors, hotels are somewhat limited and they can serve as a dampener on tourism numbers. And finally, among action-oriented items is addressing abandoned and dilapidated buildings. Due to the disinvestment I mentioned previously, and among other reasons, community appearance has become a socioeconomic challenge for the area, and this also affects visitor perception and potentially can deter tourists. The county launched this year in partnership with the Regional Economic Development Org, a new initiative to begin addressing this issue in the community. So this is something that they're actively addressing now. The next community I'd like to focus on is Peddapelli District. It's a community of about 800,000 people in the South Central Indian state of Telangana. The district has a long history of coal mining, similar to Fayette, but they also have a significant coal-fired power generation, and the coal sector generally remains highly prevalent today. Peddapelli notably produces over 25% of the state's total coal production, and it's home to the region's largest coal-fired power plant, which is about 2.6 gigawatts. Just for a bit of context for those less familiar with the Indian context, coal remains the primary source of energy for much of India, and demand is anticipated to rise. So coal is big business both for the district and the country. So as with Fayette, we wanted to understand the district's dependence on coal. Pedopoly, as you can see, has significant dependencies across the board, but I'll just focus on one, which is induced economic activity. As I previously noted, coal jobs are among the highest paid in these communities, and it's felt very acutely in Pedopoly. For example, there's an annual effect on the local economy. Each year, coal workers receive their bonuses more or less all at once, and this creates a huge increase in local spending. And as a result, many pop-up businesses exist only during this coal bonus season. And some businesses in this period can grow temporarily by 40, even 50% to meet the demand and can earn many months' earnings within this short period of time. So it's a very significant economic force in the district. We then looked at the prospective sectors for diversification, like we did with Fayette. We found several sectors of interest, and these are generally nascent or aspirational. But two things I'd like to note across the three is one, two of these sectors are derived from building out existing supply chains. So, for example, food processing, Pittapilly currently produces over 40,000 metric tons of paddy and almost 30,000 in maize annually. And for textiles, Pettapilly produces over 140,000 metric tons of cotton per year. And so there's this strong instinct to leverage existing economic activity into higher value opportunities. And it also bears pointing out that few other communities in this report have agricultural outputs at this scale vis-a-vis cotton, which kind of highlights the uniqueness of these communities. And two, the other thing I'd like to point out among these sectors is that these sectors are heavily influenced by government policy at the national and state level. It became clear among the focus group discussions and interviews, et cetera, that the financial and policy incentives provided by the government do significantly affect communities' views on how they might diversify their economies. And I'll just sneak in a third point here is that only one of these are energy related. So I just want to quickly highlight one sector, textiles manufacturing. I mentioned previously the leveraging of cotton as an opportunity for this sector. So I'll just skip directly to an example challenge, and that is price volatility. The region has a somewhat recent history of significant economic disruption in the sector due to price volatility. So this may pose a challenge for building out the sector moving forward. One of the current or possible next steps could be the creation or development of industrial areas for textiles manufacturing. As of now, I believe there's only one large-scale textiles manufacturing unit in Pettapilly, so theoretically there is room for growth here. Finally, I just want to talk through some of the recommendations that we have. We have more in the report, but just to highlight three. The first is to look beyond the energy sector for a just transition. As we saw, communities don't necessarily see themselves as major energy producers forever, and over 70% of the sectors identified in our study are not energy related. Lower carbon energy can absolutely be an economic boon to these communities, but actors in the just transition space, be it government officials, policymakers, researchers, philanthropists, they should take a serious look at non-energy sectors, and they should consider the characteristics and vision of these communities when setting up programs, research efforts, funding opportunities in order to support coal communities. The second is to factor in coal dependencies more holistically in transition planning. As I've discussed, coal has had major effects on coal communities that are frankly difficult to replace. And dependencies on coal vary considerably across communities, but while there are common themes, each coal community has its own strengths, weaknesses, and unique relationship to the coal sector. And that has implications for how effective diversification might be in helping coal communities navigate transition. And the final point, which is a bit related, is that more research into matching sectors with communities is needed. In many ways, with this study, we've only scratched the surface. And while there are many ideas about which sectors might be viable in coal communities, more research is needed to better understand how viable alternative sectors may be in these communities, whether it's to help play to their strengths, address their weaknesses, or help mitigate the gaps left behind by coal decline. Before I close, I'd just like to personally thank those in each community who welcomed us and helped us connect on the ground. I won't list names because I think I'm over time, but you know who you are, and this work would absolutely not be the same without you. So huge thank you to you all. And thank you to you all for listening, and I'll turn it over to Sandeep for our wonderful panel discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. I think you will hear a lot of me today, so bear with me. Thank you, Ian, for that great presentation. I once again, before I start the panel discussion, I already see some questions in the Q&A chat, but I want to encourage folks to put their questions in the Q&A function as we start our panel. So with that, I will begin, and we have a really awesome lineup of speakers from literally all over the world, from India to South Africa to US. And I will introduce them one on one. And before that, I want to thank all of them for taking the time to come and share your perspective on this very important topic. So we have with us Mr. Jayesh Ranjan, who is the Special Chief Secretary. He has several portfolios under his department, but so I will say he's the Special Chief Secretary of the Government of Telangana. Thank you so much, sir, for joining. We have Dr. Briggs White, who is the Deputy Executive Director of the U.S. Interagency Working Group on Coal and Power Plant Communities and Economic Revitalization. We have Shiana Gunashekara, who is the Senior Economic Advisor at the U.S. Department of Energy. We have Steve Nichols, who is the Head of Mitigation of the South African Presidential Climate Commission. And last but not the least, we have Jane Cohen, who is the Senior Program Manager at the International Energy Agency. So I will invite each speaker one by one to share their perspective, and I'll pose a question to each speaker, which is broadly an open-ended question, and I will invite them to take 5 to 7 minutes to respond to that question. If you need more time, you will have more time in the second round. And so we will go over with each panelist one by one. And then in the second round, I will again provide 2 minutes to respond to the second question. And then I think we will have enough questions from the audience, so we'll open it up for some specific or more thematic questions from the audience, which I might club together and direct at certain speakers. So I will start with Mr. Jayesh Ranjan. Thank you once again, sir, for joining. I have known Jayesh sir to be one of those senior officials who is always at the forefront of doing things. So we're very excited that you are able to join. My question to you, sir, is people in India know that Telangana is a leader in clean energy space, but how's the state thinking about the just energy transition for workers and communities in a net zero India?
Thank you, Sandeep, and greetings to all the fellow panelists. Greetings to all the participants. Before I answer, I would like to congratulate Swaniti for doing this study and publishing the findings, making some very specific recommendations. And what I really appreciate about this study is that it covers multiple geographies. So you always get a sense of what someone else is doing, what are their plans, and therefore there is something that you can possibly replicate. So instead of just studying one particular area, you have brought this comparison before us. So the first thing which I would like to tell is that, first of all, as a representative of the government, this itself is very eye-opening for us. We do have our own net zero goals. Many of you would know that our Prime Minister has committed that India will become net zero by 2070. In our state of Telangana, we are very clear that it can be done much, much faster. And while we have not officially spoken about it, but some back of the envelope kind of calculation does tell us that it would be possible for our state to become net zero by 2047. So much ahead, almost 30 years ahead of the national government. And 2047 obviously has very special significance for the country. The country will be 100 years old. And on that occasion, to say that you have become net zero will be a great thing. We are preparing our own roadmap on how do we reach that net zero target. So obviously, if something has to happen by 2047, it is not that you keep sleeping till 2046 and suddenly some miracle will happen and you will become net zero. lots of action needs to start from now itself. And usage of clean fuel, etc., is very much a part of our roadmap. And I can share a few important developments with you. So Hyderabad and the state of Telangana is a very important center for the life sciences industry. There are a large number of companies who manufacture pharmaceuticals, who manufacture vaccines, medical devices, etc. We are setting up new industrial parks for this sector. And as a conscious decision, we have taken a call that the source of energy in all these new industrial parks which are coming up will not be coal-based. Most of the earlier industrial parks, so Hyderabad, as I said, has a very special recognition for being the life sciences capital of the world. Many of the industrial parks that we see today in Hyderabad were set up in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and all of them, all the industrial plants which are located there, they're all coal-fired. And obviously, that is how the technology was 6 decades ago or 5 decades ago. But with the we now are very clear that there are better alternatives, cleaner alternatives, and obviously the goal of net zero also will be better achieved. So while we look at various other options, in fact, one other development that I can speak about is that our government, as many of you would know, about 8 months ago, we had a change of government. There's a new government now, and this government is now amongst other flagship programs. One of the flagship programs of this government is that it will set up what is being called as a net zero city. It will be a satellite township very close to the main city of Hyderabad, where again, as the name itself indicates, it will be a net zero city. So all industrial activities in that township, it's an industrial township, so there will be manufacturing, but gas will be the source of all that energy. There will be no coal, etc. So in our actions itself, we are demonstrating a very strong movement against coal. But it is also very ironical because lots of coal is mined in our state. The study itself has focused on one mining town in our state, which is called Peddapalli. One of the largest mines in the south of the country is located here. It is actually owned by the government, partly by the state government, partly by the national government, the federal government. So on the one hand, we are keen on net zero, we are stopping the usage of coal. But this question that what will happen to people whose livelihoods depend on mining, what will happen to them? I mean, this never occurred to us. So as I said, this is very eye-opening. But also when I read the report and I see the status of the other two mining locations in India, which have been profiled, which come from the state of Jharkhand. Of course, there are three locations from the US itself. But again, I'm not right now in a position to compare Peddapalli with the three locations in the US. But when I compare our scenario with Jharkhand, we are much, much better off. Our per capita income is demonstrably higher. There are other livelihood opportunities. Diversion is not very difficult. We have a very strong industrial promotion wing, which cuts across the state capital. It is there. It's present in the districts also. So it's not very difficult to work out on a alternative livelihood strategy. So I should confess that we have not done it. But as I said, after reading this report and realizing that this also will be a very important social consequence, that you will be impacting thousands of livelihoods of people who depend upon mining and allied activities. So what I have not decided to do, there are three things that I have decided to do, and I am very happy to share this with all of you. I'm also keeping an eye on the clock, so I still have 2 more minutes. So I'll quickly tell you about the three things that I intend to do. One is that, I'm sure people know of it, that, and of course, there's lots of material in your report also, using your report, which I presented, and also based on some of the data which is already available with us. There are two large industry associations in the country. One is called the CII and one is called the FICCI. Both of these industry associations have met us in the recent past and have committed that they would like to promote industrial development beyond Hyderabad. While Hyderabad is, of course, the biggest hub of industrial development in our state and possibly in the country, they want to assist the government to develop master plans, industrial development plans of a few sub-urban or semi-rural kind of locations. So I'm going to offer Peddapalli and 2, 3 other districts where coal mining is also very common to them and ask them to develop an alternate livelihoods. The second thing which I'm doing is that we are starting, and this again is something which will be one of its kind in this country, skilling university. This is called the Young India Skills University. This is a university which will be completely run by Tigers. No course will be offered in the skill university if it is not adopted by a university. So by an industry. So we will ensure that enough number of courses are introduced by the skills university, which will all be kind of delivered to candidates who are from these families who are involved in the mining sector. So a dedicated skilling program for young people whose families are in the mining industry, so that when alternative livelihood options are made available, they also have the required skills to aspire for those kind of jobs. And we will ensure that the jobs that they get are better paying than what they are getting out of their mining activity. So it is not just that because I'm stopping coal production, I'm pushing you to something else. There will be also a pull factor which will attract you to do. The third thing which I'll also be doing extensively in these districts is to promote micro entrepreneurship. Again, the report has commented about the rich pool of self-help group women, their federations, etc. So already micro entrepreneurship is happening at a low level, but I would like that to happen at a higher level, improve the quality of their product, the quality of branding, the quality of packaging, connect them to e-commerce, and see if bigger companies can use them to become their vendors and whatever is possible, the realm of micro entrepreneurship in that. So to conclude, this report has been very eye-opening, very informative, and we would like to kind of do many things starting immediately to ensure that at that point in time, when just as we have started decreasing our reliance on coal, when many other governments, many other enterprises, many other states also do that, there is no sudden shock for all these families. And already there is a just transition over a period of time. So these are some of the things which I wanted to share.
Thank you so much, sir. I mean, I think 3 decades is not a long time to, to enable an economic diversification. It's actually a very short amount of time if you look at the history of economic diversification. But I also wanted to just quickly in one line flag that we have done this study for Mancherial as well. We'll be happy to share the data with you on that as well. And that will be a larger survey-based report which will come out subsequently in a few months. So we'll follow up with you on that as well in a few months. But thank you once again. Now I would like to invite Dr. Briggs White. I'll just kind of give some background of his work, but he's basically the Deputy Executive Director of the U.S. Interagency Working Group on Coal and Power Plant Communities. IWG, or the Interagency Working Group, is a group of government officials that works to support communities and workers in the energy sector in the US. Dr. White, the question I have for you is the Inflation Reduction Act has been moving a lot of resources towards clean energy deployment. But the role of IWG, I think the instrumental role that IWG plays in US is probably lesser known, if I can say, internationally. I mean, it is known, but it could be known more. This is such a interesting initiative of the Biden administration. So could you tell us more about IWG's ongoing efforts to support coal communities in the US?
Sure.
If you want to share your slides, you can go ahead as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Sandeep, thank you. And thank you to the Swanidhi for taking on this effort and to the contributors to the report. Pulling together what are the commonalities in terms of challenges and opportunities across these various communities, I think is really important so that policymakers and others can really understand that this isn't an isolated issue, but it's actually crosses country boundaries and not just state boundaries, for example. And also really appreciate lifting up sort of what are the diversification options sometimes folks that are dealing with this are overwhelmed, and it's good to know that there's various other options out there that communities are looking at and folks can learn from each other. So thanks for pulling that together. I did prepare a couple of slides just to introduce the IWG, and then happy to answer any questions that follow. This working group includes a whole of government approach to really recognize something that was hit on earlier, which is this isn't an energy to energy transition. This is going to be an energy to wherever communities want to go next. And that could be controlled environment agriculture. It could be remediating their lands. It could be upgrading their infrastructure. It could include clean energy, but it might also include manufacturing or other sectors. And so, we wanted to bring a whole of government approach that puts the full breadth of the federal government and makes that available to support communities with wherever they want to go. That's one of our guiding principles in how we do the work. You mentioned the Inflation Reduction Act. I mean, that has been huge. We've seen already over $315 billion of private sector capital go into energy communities since the Inflation Reduction Act was passed. So that's really catalyzing a lot of private sector investment, which is creating jobs, which is creating the tax base, which ultimately needs to be built back up when these coal assets retire. And so that economic diversification, one piece of that could be the clean energy pathway, which the Inflation Reduction Act will incentivize, but it also could be data centers, it could be recycling, it could be remediating the lands, which will create jobs and improve environmental benefits. So a lot of different ways to get that economic revitalization and diversification, both on the private sector through things like catalyzing through the Inflation Reduction Act, but also the federal funds. We've had $39 billion of federal funds that have gone into energy communities in the United States. These transitions take a while, as you said, and so those funds, as they roll out, they're not going to fix all of the problems overnight. And we know that they haven't reached every community across the country. So there's more work to be done, but those funds do continue to roll out. And we look to try to see where we can fill in gaps and lift up the successes. I did want to mention that similar to your report, we have been doing some listening and sort of categorizing what we've been hearing over the last few years. And it usually starts with the need to diversify the economy, replace the tax base and the jobs that could be going away. One frequent challenge is that communities are rural, isolated, and lack the capacity to really do the visioning and drive the economic development that they need. And so capacity building and the need for that has come up a lot. Also, bringing down the barriers to accessing federal resources. We know that the federal government can be complicated and difficult to navigate in getting those federal resources, particularly through national competitions where these low capacity communities are having to compete on a national scale for funds is challenging. And I think your report lifted up that as one of the policy recommendations. So we're doing a variety of things to try to simplify the whole grants acquisition process. But we also know that the private sector is going to be super important here. We mentioned the $315 billion of capital. And so communities need tools and they need assistance, they need networking in order to connect with those private sector players, and vice versa. Private sector players are looking to make investments, they're looking to get a return on their capital. And coal communities can be a great opportunity to do that. They have the workers, the land, the brownfields that can be repurposed, they have transmission access, they have water, maybe they have coal resources that can be used for critical minerals, rare earth elements, other kinds of economic development opportunities. And so, we want to try to be the matchmaker and also make it easier to use these federal resources to ultimately catalyze the private sector, which is going to be really putting a lot of investment into these places. I did want to mention that we do recognize that it's not the most help just to be in Washington, D.C., but we actually have to be in these coal communities. And since your report focused on Wyoming, I wanted to just spend a minute there. We have had what we call a rapid response team in Wyoming now for a few years. And basically that works with the state, with community organizations, with local officials, with worker representatives to try to understand what are the challenges, where do the communities want to go, and then make sure that we're being a good partner to connect them with the resources, the information that they need. I do want to lift up sort of a best case scenario, which is in the state of Wyoming. The governor's office is supported providing funds that can match against the federal funds, which we know is a big barrier. Also trying to provide grant writing training and other support systems to access federal grants that can help coal communities. And also to the local folks, this work doesn't get done unless you have strong leadership at the local level that's putting forth a compelling vision and going out and trying to bring in private sector investment and trying to lead on environmental remediation and other kinds of projects. So that's really important in Wyoming. We've seen a lot of really good work happening there. We also are planning to build out our network to include West Virginia. We've actually done, I think, more events in West Virginia than really any place else in the country. And so appreciated your deep dive into Fayette County there. And we're going to continue to build that out in Appalachia and also out in the Intermountain West in Montana moving forward. But none of that happens without really good partners at the state and local level. And I do want to also emphasize that on the capacity building area, one thing we've done is invested in actual boots on the ground through our partnership with AmeriCorps. And so we are actually putting volunteers in coal communities so that they can help with things like grant writing, community convening, getting information out so folks are aware of that kind of thing. The last thing I just wanted to mention was that in trying to simplify all of this, we've created what we call a one-stop shop, which was something that stakeholders asked for. And really, it just puts a lot of information at the fingertips. So we have a clearinghouse of funding opportunities that you can sort through. We have an actual human being navigator that you can email and get answers to your questions about funding opportunities and get connected with the right federal official to help move your project forward. We've been curating success stories and case studies so people can learn from each other. We've created a getting started guide, and that's really just a recognition that like sometimes people have never gone through this transformation before and they don't really know where to get started. Or maybe they're a little further down the path, but they're looking for some inspiration of ways to tackle these problems. You can start anywhere in a 10-step guide and move that forward. The last thing I wanted to mention is maps and tools. Increasingly, the private sector is looking for opportunities to make investments. And so we've tried to take public information that's available about these energy communities and make that easier to digest so that folks can make the decision to invest in these coal communities. So information around like the Inflation Reduction Act tax credits that can incentivize the investment, but also things like transmission access, water access, et cetera, just to help support those decisions. So we've created a number of maps and tools on our website as well that's available. So with that, I just wanted to just end by saying thank you for putting this all together. It's really helpful, and none of this would be possible without the partners that we have at the local, state, and level. So thank you again.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. White, for sharing an overview of the interagency and all the different very important initiatives that the interagency has undertook. This actually could be lessons for a lot of people who are trying to navigate this very, very tough transition, if I can call it. So with that, I want to invite my friend Siana Gunasekara, who is the Senior Economic Advisor at the U.S. Department of Energy. I know you're very interested in this topic, so would love to hear your thoughts. I have a very specific question for you, which intersects with your role at DOE. I know that the last year, the US and India, under the Strategic Clean Energy Partnership between US Department of Energy and Niti Aayog in India, published a report on just transition that aimed at exploring sort of regional collaborations and partnerships between coal-rich US states and coal-rich Indian states. But I'm curious to hear, Sienna, generally, like, how's the DOE following up on that initiative? And in general, how is the DOE's international office trying to help other countries in their just transition processes? Over to you.
Thank you, Sandeep and Ian and Suniti for inviting me and the Department of Energy's Office of International Affairs to join this important conversation. The work you guys have done in this study is really exciting. And you know this because I talk about it all the time, how thrilled I am about this report coming out. But it's really because much of what we do in the Office of International Affairs is fundamentally driven by some kind of exchange when it comes to our bilateral partners. You know, and this is an exchange of information and best practices, technical expertise, what have you, with these other countries. And it's really, it's those kinds of exchanges that are really critical during this time, where there are major discrepancies in information, access to information, skills, funding across the world, even though the goal to decarbonize right now is largely aligned. And so this report does a really nice job in laying out the opportunities both abroad and here at home to be able to tackle the energy transition together. So you bring up a really good starting point, which is the Strategic Clean Energy Partnership. And so overall, DOE, in partnership with SCEP, that's what we call it, and NITI Aayog, we continue to prioritize energy transition by focusing on opportunities on emerging clean energy technologies. I think that's really like our focus point, especially with India. And I'll start with India for this round. So following the release of that report, I would say that DOE's really just deepened its collaboration with India. It's one of our, that partnership with India is one of our longest standing ones at the Department of Energy, both at the national and subnational level. And it's not only do we work on, the technical expertise related to the clean energy transition, but also the principles that guide that transition. And in terms of following up specifically on that report, good timing. Just earlier this week, the Department of Energy Secretary Jennifer Granholm hosted Indian Minister of Petroleum and Natural Gas, Hardeep Singh Puri, here in Washington, D.C., and I think this was on Monday, for a SCEP ministerial. And so both of the governments just on Monday reaffirmed their commitment to a just and sustainable energy transition. And DOE has been actively supporting initiatives that facilitate this transition through public and private partnerships, which Dr. Whitehead mentioned, and capacity building efforts. And these efforts include RETAP, which is the Renewable Energy, we have a lot of acronyms in government, the Renewable Energy Technology Action Platform in 2023. And that aims to develop active, actionable roadmaps for hydrogen, like zero carbon hydrogen, energy storage, and other emerging clean energy technologies. And these efforts are really they're designed to help coal-dependent regions transition to new sectors by providing training and investment in these emerging fields. But I do note that one of the key takeaways from the report was that we shouldn't necessarily focus on kind of not forcing, but imposing energy, like a new energy sector in a coal dependent community. So that is noted, and it's something I'll take back. But I do see that, as a Department of Energy, that is kind of our role. We're not going to come in and promote. We cannot necessarily give folks the tools to be promoting tourism, but we do see a lot of overlap in skills and interest in coal dependent communities in other kinds of power generating fuel economies. So one thing I will mention is the Public and Private Hydrogen Task Force. That has specifically allowed for bilateral expert exchanges on zero carbon hydrogen, and it supports projects like hydrogen buses and overall industrial carbonization. And the other element, which again, it's not necessarily power generation fuel, but energy storage. I think that has really emerged as like a big area of alignment between the US and India. The Energy Storage Task Force has really taken off for our office this year. It's another initiative that was discussed at the ministerial, and it focused on grid integration and battery storage in Indian states like Assam and Haryana that do have quite a sizable population of disadvantaged folks and folks who are at risk of being left behind in the energy transition. But we have noticed potential for large-scale renewable deployment there, and so we see that as a pretty awesome opportunity to work together. But overall, I think the ongoing collaboration between India and the US on this national level also underlies the importance of supporting the regional and subnational governments, despite how challenging that could be politically in both countries, as they move away from coal and other fossil fuels. I think by leveraging these programs like RETAP, DOE can work closely with Indian counterparts to facilitate workforce transitions, infrastructure development, and overall sustainable economic growth in these coal-dependent regions. I will say there's a couple of other really interesting programs that we have continued to work on since last year's report. Our office is heavily involved with PACER, so that's another acronym, the Partnership to Advance Clean Energy, the Partnership to Advance Clean Energy Research. And that focuses on opportunities in the clean energy transition, specifically with fossil fuels in smart grids and energy storage. And they highlight and put a lot of resources in workforce training for these emerging technologies. And lately, they've been doing a lot of work on disadvantaged communities. And I think recently they were helping to electrify a few villages through these pilot programs in both urban and semi-urban and rural areas. So they're kind of tying in a couple of these elements of like workforce training, but also addressing some of the biggest challenges in these disadvantaged communities when it comes to energy access. And I'm not sure how I am on time, but I do want to mention that we work on, India was the host of the G20 last year. This year it'll be Brazil. And so when we work with these host countries, we do try to highlight a just energy transition, right? So last year it was pretty impressive. For the first time, they were able to formulate these voluntary principles that help countries and even companies that are referring to these documents. Like they're offering these guidelines for how to move ethically in the just energy transition, right? And there's never been language like that in any of the G20 communiques until last year. And so this is important because it will likely stick around for a while. That's what we anticipate. And this year, Brazil's hosting, and we believe that we'll see a bit of a consensus on these principles for a just and inclusive transition. That's what Brazil is hoping to do. And so we're going to be supporting them in a few months, I want to say. But it's been a priority not only for the Department of Energy, but also the Department of Labor and our Office of Environmental Justice. So I might want to leave it there. I know I have a couple other points, but I can probably cover that in the next.
Right. I'm sure I will come back to you with more pointed questions. I took some notes while you were speaking. Thank you. That's really helpful. I think, in the arc of transition, given just the situation where US is at, the coal transition is accelerated, so the lessons from US are quite useful for other countries of what to do and what not to do, both. So the DOE's effort in working with other governments is quite appreciated. Next, we have with us Steve Nichols, who is the head of South African Presidential Climate Commission. For those who don't know what PCC is, it's referred to as a PCC. It is an independent statutory multi-stakeholder body established by the President of South Africa, and its purpose is to oversee and facilitate a just and equitable transition towards low carbon emissions and climate resilient economy. I also know that Steve is really passionate about this topic. So very, very excited to have Steve share his thoughts on this. The question I have for Steve is that, of course, this report focuses on US and India, but through the earlier work we have done, we're very familiar that the story in South Africa is it's similar. It's never same. It's similar in terms of dependencies and the question of diversification. So can you share with us how South Africa is thinking about economic diversification as a just transition strategy, especially for those places within the country where, just transition is a really, very important topic. So Steve, over to you. I will remind to keep on time if possible. Just we want to go through the second round and then open it up for some questions. There's already so many questions, so I want to take them out. So Steve, over to you.
Sure, thanks very much. I want to pick up on a comment you made in your introduction that just transition is seen very differently in different places, but that includes inside those places. So just transition in South Africa is a hotly contested conversation. And one of the purposes of the PCC is to try to get consensus around what a just transition looks like. And the way that we did that was releasing what we call a just transition framework, which describes how we as the country see just transition. And that has been approved by cabinet, and in theory should then start to permeate across planning throughout government. And I wanted to highlight that the just transition framework identifies 5 levers that we need to be able to pull. Economic diversification, institutional strengthening, particularly at local government level, social protection for those not caught in the employment net, skills development and labor market reform, and then finally finance. And so I guess my first point about economic diversification is it's fundamental to all of these processes, but it exists in the system. So you can't do economic diversification without addressing those other issues, which just kind of adds a layer of complexity. So that was kind of my first point. My second point is economic diversification exists at a range of levels. So it exists at international level, national level, regional level, and local level. And at the international level, there are enabling factors like trade, finance, and means of implementation that seriously influence how you can think about economic diversification at a country level, particularly a country of our size. So I was fascinated by Dr. White's statistic on the amount of money invested in IRA. It's about 75% of South Africa's annual GDP. So these are impressive numbers. And so we're a small economy. We are a very open economy, and so we're very much reliant on our trade partners. And so the means with which countries manage our trade is very interesting. At a national level, it's very important to have a uniting plan. And I'm not certain that South Africa has that at the moment. And the consequence of not having one kind of vision for how you diversify the economy is you end up picking the things that are the most popular. So we have a hydrogen strategy, and we have a critical mineral strategy, which basically every country in the world has. So it's not necessarily a differentiator for us. There's been some very good and interesting work on how we might localize the manufacture of renewable energy components. But again, in the absence of that national plan, you basically don't do enough. And so I would sort of point out at this stage that South Africa's unemployment is over 30%, amongst the highest in the world. Our Gini coefficient, and therefore inequality, is amongst the highest in the world. And about 55% of people live in poverty. And so it is very important that we do more in order to address these kinds of issues. And one of the core challenges with economic diversification, particularly at this national level, is you're required to think more like a venture capitalist. You have to have lots of balls in the air and hope that some of them take. And so we're asking institutions that are fundamentally predicated not to take risk, and individuals within those institutions to act and think like venture capitalists. And that's a sort of a tall order. So it's kind of the thinking around a national level, but really at the local level, we see the very same kinds of things that are discussed in your report. And every community is different. So the key transition region in South Africa is called Mpumalanga, and most of our coal mining is there, and the levels of poverty and unemployment in Mpumalanga are particularly high. So we have 40% unemployment in Mpumalanga and a staggering 60% youth unemployment. So these are tremendous challenges in an area that, dependent on coal, these are things that the risk of people getting left behind are extremely high, and something that requires careful attention. And even within Mpumalanga, there are kind of 3 regions, one that's driven predominantly by tourism, one that's predominantly driven by industrial efforts, and then the last by agriculture. So to your point that you raise in the report about trying to map opportunities to communities, these communities have very different strengths and very different kind of desires in life. So those are some of the core challenges. Coal jobs in other areas that you cite are very highly paid, and dependencies within the system are enormous. So the banks are servicing the coal sector, the informal economy is servicing the coal sector, the retail sectors, so it's a significant disruptive force. On the flip side of that, as you transition, so our famous case study is called Komati. As you transition, these communities are located in very rural spaces, far from economic hubs, but you don't need to create thousands of jobs. You need to create a couple of hundred jobs to kind of stabilize those communities. And so finding a particular industry that you can stimulate in that area is key. And so the challenge here is, how do you find one that can be independent of location, so it's not critical that it's not near or as close as possible to markets, and that can have the social outcome. But ultimately, it's going to require some kind of subsidy. So we've been doing similar kinds of studies to what you have, looking at different kinds of industries that you could stimulate. And the top three for us are sustainable aviation fuels, hemp, and forestry. And sustainable aviation fuel is very much driven by availability of biomass, which raises a whole separate set of climate-related challenges, for example, water availability and land availability. And so you can't quite get away from these climate issues, even when you're looking at what you might want to stimulate. So I guess in conclusion, the challenge is quite large. You have to be thinking about economic diversification all the way from international relations down to national planning, and obviously very specifically local planning, and trying to find opportunities that exist independent of location, given that you need to stimulate employment in areas that are quite far from markets in many cases. But I'll leave it there, and thanks once again for including me. I'm excited to get into the detail of your report.
Thank you so much, Steve. That was really interesting to hear what are the plans in South Africa and all the studies. I'd be curious to read all the studies that come out. Next, we are really like behind on time, and I'm being a really terrible moderator in allowing everybody extra time, but it's great. I don't want to stop people from speaking. This is all great stuff. Next, we will move over to Jane Cohen, who is the Senior Program Manager at the International Energy Agency. And Jane and IEA have been running the People-Centered Clean Energy Transitions Program that basically aims to support governments for ensuring their clean energy transitions are truly fair and just. So Jane, my question to you is, the IEA as well as many governments emphasize that energy systems are changing through many, many technologies. And as we note in our report, that different parts of the energy sector are quite intertwined with communities, right? You know, the value chains are quite different and it manifests in very different ways. So how is the IEA thinking about varied socioeconomic impacts of these technologies on coal-reliant communities? If you can also keep on time, I would really appreciate it.
Don't worry, Sandeep. I'm gonna help your whole schedule get back on track. And I could do that just by saying the Swanita report is just so excellent, and I think such an important contribution to this discussion. And also, as every one of our speakers was talking, I was thinking like, yes, like so many points that I just want to echo. So I'll go quickly here and let others jump back in. But let me say first, to your point about the people-centered work at the IEA. The IEA is traditionally an organization that's very focused on kind of energy modeling and energy security. And the fact that now we have started this people-centered program, I think really goes to acknowledging that clean energy transitions really will not be successful unless we really use it as an opportunity to ensure that everybody has access to energy, that communities are not only not impacted, but have positive social benefits from these transitions, and that we really use this opportunity to increase the well-being of people around the world. And I'm personally very proud that the IEA has sort of taken this big step. I'm happy to have the opportunity to work with partners like those of us here today. So in terms of this question of economic diversification, so one of the big issues that we look at in general is the impact on our workforce. But of course, when you're talking in particular about coal communities, you're really talking about communities. I think that's the first point to make, is that a lot of times in just transition discussion, so we use the term people-centered, which is sort of taking just transition and saying yes, and all of these other pieces. So you have your kind of labor dynamics, but you have all of these different pieces around communities, which I think many of our speakers have outlined really, really well. And when you see these kinds of changes in the workforce in communities that are so heavily reliant on, for example, coal mining, coal processing, energy generation, you're going to see those impacts across those communities. So the two things that I really want to highlight here, and again, I'll do it quickly and we can move along, are the need to really have participatory processes and the fact that that's very hard. And I just want to sort of put that out there because I think there's really there's a sense that you can kind of do that in a way and check that box. But that is really not at all the case. And I appreciate a lot the mixed methods approach that this report employs, because it recognizes that these transitions are not just about the kind of data, jobs in, jobs out, et cetera, that this is about people's identities. This is about what people want their futures to look like, what their communities to look like. And so really having a very engaged process, and not just with labor, although labor is such a huge piece and needs to be engaged, of course, but also community members at large. So that's the first point. But the second point, and again, this has been mentioned, but I will just echo it, is the need for really comprehensive planning. I think it's overwhelming. Let me say I'm a former policymaker, and thinking about all these different pieces that need to go together to have the kind of comprehensive planning that's necessary to have these transitions in the way that I think we all sort of envision them to be is just very difficult, but it can be done. And in order for it to be done, it has to be done at the most micro scale we can imagine, and the macro scale and everything in between. So for example, Spain is in their just transition mechanism, they really think about this worker by worker in their most impacted communities. And we're not really used to that kind of planning in almost anything. Do we think about sort of the individual when we think about, national policy? But it is really at that level. And so as sort of an international community, thinking about the financial resources that are needed to mobilize at all these different levels is really, really key. I'll just end by saying I saw a very interesting presentation about a coal community in Western Australia recently, where I think they really kind of did this and they're still doing it. This is not something that's sort of over, but I was very struck by just the real persistence of the people who are working on transition in this area, the labor unions, the local government, the communities, the community-based organizations. And again, just this really deep engagement in the community, the role of the government in thinking about this question of economic diversification, the partnership in that government's kind of thinking about it and putting financial resources into it with what the local community wanted and wants. It's just, it can be done. But I think we should all be very clear-eyed about the work that it really takes to get there. So thank you very much for having me, and I will hand it back over to you, Sandeep.
Thank you so much, Jane. It's always tough to be the last speaker, but really, I love the point you made about this. This is a really local to global topic. It has such serious local to global dynamics, and we want to make sure that at every level, sort of this topic and the need for economic diversification is played out. We have completely run out of time, but what I'm going to do is we're going to do round two combined with audience questions, so that we're true to the programming that we had promised. So I will start in the same order, just to keep things simple. I'll start with Mr. Jayesh Ranjan again. Sir, very, very briefly, I have two questions. Question one is like, now that you have heard about this report and you highlighted the net zero plan, and you highlighted three very important steps that you will undertake. Like, how would economic diversification really strongly feature in that? And the second but connected question in that is like, when you did this net zero mapping, what were some of the key barriers that emerged in that net zero mapping? So I've combined some questions from audience and asking some of my own as well.
Yeah, so I'll take the second part first, and I'll be very quick with both the answers. So, see, multiple interventions are getting suggested. If you have to reach net zero by 2070 or 2047, or at any time, sooner or later, you can't rely on just one strategy. There are multiple interventions. Some of these interventions are what are called low-hanging fruits. You can implement them very easily. Some of them just require some behavioral change. Some of them are already happening in Telangana. For example, planting trees. So, I mean, if you have planted 100 trees, why not plant 1,000 trees and so on and so forth. So some are easy to accomplish. Some require multiple stakeholders to come together, you reach a consensus. There are economic uh, liabilities if you have to take some intervention. Some appear to be impossible. I mean, we will only be wasting our time and effort if we need to do that. And it is better to ignore that and overcompensate that by doing something more. So that is how it is being worked out. We have not created that roadmap fully. These are initial days. But of course, green manufacturing, green mobility or sustainable mobility, these are things which will be happening quite largely. And when it comes to green manufacturing, one of the important requirements will be that coal should not be the source of energy. So the issue is not to stop coal mining in a direct way, but ensure that the industries or the activities which rely on coal, that they kind of get phased out with some proper substitute. So as I said, some of these will require consensus. There'll be cost benefit analysis, purely financial costs, not even economic costs, but how much financially it will take to change your systems from coal based to something else, etc., etc. So we have not reached there, but I'm very sure that green manufacturing will be an important intervention because Telangana is a manufacturing state, Hyderabad is a manufacturing city or a hub, and therefore how to phase out coal-based manufacturing into green manufacturing will be an important thing. The first part of it on how important economic diversification will be. So obviously, so the state has earned lots of reputation for being the state which increased its per capita income the highest in the last 10 years. In fact, some of you may know this, that Telangana was created as a new state or a separate state 10 years ago. And the experience of previous years when new states were created is not very rosy. If you look at how those states have performed, they're still kind of languishing. And there was a very severe risk and doubt whether Telangana can do any better. But in 10 years, to show that this is a state which has seen the highest per capita income improvements. We are number 2 in the country in terms of per capita income after Delhi. And Delhi, as we all know, is more of a city than a city state. So if you look at mainstream states, we are number 1, followed by Karnataka. So obviously, we would like to maintain this position, and any risk or jeopardy that income levels will come down because of macro circumstances, macro factors, will be detrimental to the state itself, and it will put a big question mark on the governance approach, governance priority. So we would not like to get into that trap. And we would like to be well alert, well ahead of time, well ahead of the curve. And that is why in my earlier answer, I told that we will be doing this economic diversification will ensure that better paying jobs are available, which will require better skills. And therefore, we have a strategy to do that as well.
Thank you so much, sir. Really, really appreciate your time. Thank you for taking the time and sharing the vision, and really appreciate your comments on the report as well. Next, I will move to Dr. Briggs. I have two questions for you, Dr. Briggs. One is, as a strategy, you did mention a little bit about it, but maybe we can sort of go a bit more deeper. but briefly go deeper on the question of what is the overall IWG's thinking on economic diversification for energy communities, and the second, as IWG is thinking about economic diversification, some of which will be through new development of new technologies. Is there a question of any negative impacts of new technologies? We know that they will bring jobs, etc., but is there a fear of building in new technologies in coal communities and creating any challenge? And I don't know if that thinking is being undertaken at IWG.
So thanks for the question. And, we started with guiding principles around, centering activity that is community-led and that no place is exactly the same. And in a couple of different dimensions, some communities will have different assets than other ones, and some communities will have already been hit by the energy transition, and some may be facing closures in the future. For those that have already seen the jobs and the workers move away, they may have a very different perspective. And there are things like downtown revitalization, small business development, et cetera, may be more attractive. In other areas where the workers are still there and they're making these very high wages with lots of benefits and have these skills, that's really an asset. And so in those kinds of places, it would only be natural to continue trying to do industrial development that can provide those kinds of wages and so on. And so I think it depends a little bit on what are the assets and what's the timeline. And I think it's only natural for a lot of energy communities to want to continue staying in the energy space, but also lots of frontline communities that have received the negative impacts of pollution burden and so on. They may want to move on and diversify their economies in different ways. And they also may be concerned about things like the availability of water and so on and so forth. And so, again, we start with sort of what is the community-led interest there in providing them with the planning resources, as Jane mentioned, so that they can ultimately envision their future and drive that and connect it with where the macroeconomic trends are going, which is going to provide investments in things like manufacturing, deployment, et cetera. So, we certainly want to be clear-eyed about what potential challenges could play out down the road. And I think that just starts with maintaining an open dialogue and being transparent with communications.
Thank you so much. Again, also thanking you for your time and coming and sharing your thoughts on this, I think, very important topic. Sienna, moving over to you. My question to you is how is the Office of International Affairs thinking about impacts of energy transition, sort of on other sectors, and how the office globally is trying to help in communities at risk? I mean, it touches upon your first question, but trying to go a bit more deeper into that question.
Yeah, I'll keep it short because I know we're limited on time, or we're in negative time right now. So I'll talk about one example that comes to mind. But I will say overall, in all the work we've done, especially under this administration, we do have a just energy transition lens, right, in the work that we do. Now, and that's really important when it comes to just our staff and in understanding what that concept is and how we engage with our counterparts. Because sometimes our projects don't always come to fruition, right? But at least our engagements, at the very least, are of that mindset. We have that intention set, and we, at the very least, negotiate our multilateral agreements, things like that, with that in mind. And so that is always at least on record. And it kind of, like I said earlier, it guides a lot of the principles that we have to not only signal to the market, but also signal to our counterparts abroad, right? What our intention is and how we will be at the negotiating table. I think overall, the International Affairs Office at DOE recognizes that the energy transition has far-reaching implications beyond just the energy sector, even though we are a Department of Energy. But we're talking about influencing industries like manufacturing, transportation, agriculture. And so in response, DOE has taken very much a holistic approach during this administration to the energy transition and looking at supply chains specifically, and also job markets related to these other supply chains, local economies, and also communities that are most dependent on traditional fossil fuels. And so the one initiative I'm thinking of that we have worked on with our Indian counterparts is under the Indo-US Science and Technology Forum. It's called the Solar Decathlon. It's been quite a success from what I've heard. I haven't really engaged in it, but it's about building the next generation of solar building experts. And so again, this is more a little bit less about power generation, but more about a little bit more holistic supply chain industry. So we're talking about solar buildings. And they brought about 2,000 participants from India. We launched back in 2022. And the teams in the US, which is where it started, help with the modeling and some of the technical expertise. And they have an MOU between the two governments, which has allowed this to continue to grow. And I think they've worked on some really interesting efforts related to energy efficiency for affordable housing specifically. So this is one of the initiatives I've seen of where working with disadvantaged communities and also working with energy efficiency, which I think is the first renewable energy type, but and also working on again moving communities off of coal or other fossil fuels. All those things kind of come to play in initiatives like this, right? We're talking about some of the youngest folks, like high school, college, graduate students, also folks who only have vocational kinds of training, which is becoming a bigger thing in India and around the world. So I think that's really seeing these kinds of issues play out in an intersectional space is really exciting. And so we continue to put more of our eggs in that basket. But overall, I think separately from the programmatic work, I talk about negotiating, and we've done a lot to create these policy frameworks that support retaining workers and revitalizing these local economies through innovation, specifically innovation and emerging clean energy technology. And so promoting cross-sectoral engagement, creating job opportunities in those technologies like battery storage, EVs, zero emissions, hydrogen. I think that's one of the key ways that DOE is helping to ensure that these communities that are most vulnerable in the energy transition benefit, or at least access some of these economic benefits of a clean energy transition. So again, like I said, we work on the programmatic side, but we also work on creating these frameworks and agreements that all these countries sign on to as a signal to the market of what are our government's priorities, right, moving forward. Like what will we encourage the private sector to do? What will you have our backing on? And having a just energy lens and I guess flair when you're writing these agreements is really important, right, to have that underpinning. So we've really seen that shift under this administration in the last 4 years. So it's pretty exciting.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much for that. Steve, we'll move to you very quickly. Just one quick question to you. Does the PCC have any advice for other countries looking to diversify local coal-dependent economies? The reason I ask this is because in South Africa, this is such a prominent topic, and I'm sure many people have thought about this. So if you have any suggestions for other places thinking about economic diversification, that'd be great.
Yeah, I mean, I'll make 3 quick points from our sort of practical experience. Some of it should be made. I think the key point is to involve people, and many have made this point already. In our Just Transition Framework, we talk about 3 principles: procedural justice, distributional justice, and restorative justice. You have to be thinking about those 3 things consistently. And the procedural justice component is, how do you involve people in making decisions about their lives? And labor in South Africa has a wonderful phrase, basically, no decisions about us without us. And I think that's an important principle to approach this with. The other thing is timing. You've got to get out ahead of these changes and not get yourself into a situation where we have, in some of our cases, as I mentioned in Komati, where we've recently closed down a plant, without putting in place the other alternative livelihood and employment opportunities, and without having done the skills programs ahead of time. We're running them now, but it's too late. The research shows that the employment opportunities are better, that the economics are better, but in reality for those communities, what they are doing is being forced to take a short-term known risk, closing the plant, losing their livelihoods, for a long-term, relatively uncertain future. And so that obviously creates resistance. Like, why would it not? So that's something you've got to get out ahead of. And then the last is this idea of matchmaking is correct but challenging. And one of the big problems we have in South Africa is a lack of pipeline. And so you have to invest in all of these different areas, institutional capacity, social support, finance simultaneously so that you can generate investment opportunities. Otherwise, you have capital sitting around with nowhere to go. Thanks.
Wonderful. Thank you, Steve. I really appreciate your time. Next, we'll go to Jane. I'm really sorry, Jane. You're always going last, and I know that you have another meeting coming up as well. So I'll ask a very pointed question, take a brief moment to respond to it. We know that IEA really supports national governments, but is there a plan or a goal that IEA has to support subnational governments? Because just transition or people-centered stuff is really at what's really happening is that the action is happening at the subnational level. So curious to hear if you have any plans or how you think about that.
Thanks for the question. And yes, I will be the last speaker, so I'll go quickly. I mean, I think to what I said before, yes, a lot of the action is happening at the subnational and the most local level, but it is also happening at the national level and at the international level. So we are engaging on all levels, from really specific best practices for local policymaking to supporting discussions around climate finance and sort of across the board. I will say again, though, that this planning piece, which is so key, because is something that from the IEA perspective we really want to encourage. At the end of 2023, just 14% of workers in coal dependent countries were covered by just transition plans. So that's a really, really small amount. And we want to see that grow. We want to see those planning processes. We are working on our data and analysis to help governments in their decision making. But it's really that planning that, as Steve Nichols just mentioned, that real participation from labor and other groups. Those are the key points that we are really pushing, at all levels.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I really wish I had like hours because we could talk about this really important topic for a very, very long time. But we have completely run out of time. We're in fact over time. So I will officially close this. But before I close, I want to thank all of you that have joined from around the world. We had over 100 participants, over 300 registrations. We will make the report available. I think it's in the chat function. And I also want to thank all our speakers. Thank you so much for your time. I cannot tell you how much we appreciate your time and sharing your really important initiatives and perspectives. Thank you so much once again, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening again, like depending on where in the world you are. Bye for now. We'll close this webinar. Thank you again.